Dr. Brian Palmer, social anthropologist who teaches at Uppsala University, thank you very much for sitting down with us today on RT.
It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Sweden has been in the spotlight quite a bit lately with the WikiLeaks scandal and the spy and sex probes into Julian Assange. Why does Sweden want Julian Assange to be extradited? Is it just for, to be questioned rather, for the sex crimes alleged against him?
It's hard to say. Certainly, sexual misconduct is taken seriously in Sweden, but few cases get anywhere near the kind of judicial energy behind them as this had. So there seems to also be other factors at play. It may be partly the prosecutors and lawyers involved and issues of their careers. It may also be that there's some pressure from the foreign policy establishment in Sweden and even from the United States that's playing a role.
Do you think that eventually Assange will in fact be extradited to Sweden?
It wouldn't surprise me if he is in the end, but I would say that he and his lawyers have a fighting chance of keeping him there and suggesting that whatever questioning of him the Swedish prosecutors want to do can easily be done by video link.
And many critics say that once and if Assange is extradited to Sweden, that it will be very easy for the US to get him into custody. Do you agree with that?
I think that's quite right, that it would be easier to get him to the US from Sweden than from Britain. The Swedish government has shown itself to be more pliant than the British, surprisingly, given the so-called special relationship of trust between Britain and the USA. And the Swedish press has been, and Swedish public intellectuals have been less vocal in defending WikiLeaks than many people and many papers in Britain. So I think he's safer there.
Why do you think that the media has been reluctant to, am I understand correctly, openly cover WikiLeaks or cover it in a way that looks like Assange has a fair chance?
There's been a lot of coverage of WikiLeaks and Assange in Sweden, but he doesn't have that many high-profile champions. It's partly because allegations of sexual misconduct weigh so heavily here that it is a country where feminist ideals are maybe stronger than anywhere else on earth, and one wishes that no one would be judged in a case until they've been tried, but there's some hesitation to come to his defense on those grounds. And then so much of our media in Sweden is owned by a few conservative-leaning media houses, particularly Bonniers, a media group that's right-leaning and has every interest in not raising these questions, and they're the largest player in the media market in Sweden.
You wrote a biography of the Swedish Prime Minister, and it's no secret, you wrote about this, that the Prime Minister has been or is being advised by U.S. Republican strategist Karl Rove. Why one of America's most notorious neocons, and the man, of course, most credited with getting Bush into the White House?
It's an interesting question because the Conservative Party, called the Moderates, have plenty of Machiavellian strategists of their own, plenty of Karl Roves of their own. But Rove has a long-term relationship with the Moderates. Already in the 1980s, he came to Sweden to advise them, and then he's been back before the election in 2006, and even more recently. He himself has some Swedish roots, and I think it may be partly initiative from his side that he wants to be involved in politics here. And then what the moderates accomplished before the 2006 election had something in common with Bush's electoral victory in 2000. The problem for both George Bush and Frederick Reinfeldt was to win the votes of groups who wouldn't necessarily benefit from having a right-wing tax-cutting regime in power. Bush succeeded so well in wooing working-class votes that in the 2006 election, the 2004 election, Bush won the white working class by a 23% margin. So working class voters were really the backbone of his victory. Reinfeldt acknowledged that he was impressed by Bush's campaign, and his struggle was also to get working class voters to support his party, which they hadn't done in the past. And so it's logical that he would have wanted to bring in some of the people from Bush's campaign to help with that, and not least Karl Rove.
Now, you've said the method is linguistic innovations, media manipulation, and the art of bringing smear campaigns. Is that what Sweden wants to take from a strategist like Karl Rove?
The moderates won the past two elections very much because of the negative image of Fredrik Reinfeldt's opponent in both elections. It was very much the weakness of the opponent people were voting against, rather than attraction to Reinfeldt. And how to accomplish that through different kinds of negative campaigning in the broad meaning of campaigning that focuses on the deficits of the other candidate, was something that Rove has been very good at. So he would be a relevant advisor there. Another thing that Rove has been something of a genius at is finding peripheral issues that will mobilize the right voter groups to support the Republicans, and that strategy has also been somewhat effective in Sweden.
Is it normal for Karl Rove to be doing this kind of international advising?
No. On his own website he notes that Sweden is his only international assignment. The Moderate Party of Sweden is the only foreign party that he's worked for. So as far as I know, he's a pretty US-focused person. But then again, as mentioned, he himself has Swedish roots, and he may feel a particular obligation to be involved here, or interest to be involved here.
How much influence do you think the US on a whole, from Assange to NATO to asylum seekers being taken into custody, have on Sweden?
Enormous influence, and in a way almost puzzlingly so at this historical moment, that Sweden should be so eager to host NATO military exercises in the north, to share intelligence information at a very high level with the US and NATO, that Fredrik Reinfeldt was so very eager to visit Bush. It was one of his first major international visits after he became Prime Minister in 2006. All of that is a bit puzzling when the US is no longer so central to Sweden's exports, for example, as it has been at certain periods when European relations ought to be more central to Sweden in certain ways. And all of this is a far cry from the Sweden of the 1970s and early 80s, when Olof Palme was Prime Minister, and when the most important relations were often with developing nations, with the South African freedom movement, with India, with the non-aligned movement, so that the once very progressive Sweden has become something of a voluntary apprentice state, some would say vassal state, of the USA. And
why do you think that Sweden took those kind of policy moves?
I think a lot of it is admiration for the United States among the foreign policy elite in Sweden, many of whose members have studied at top universities in the US and spent time there and have a good network of personal friendships in the US. And then now with the conservative government since 2006, those ties have become even stronger. The motto of one of the young people's divisions of the Conservative Party over many years was, we would like things to be like in the USA, vi vill ha det som i USA in Swedish. So an open wish to see a more Americanized Sweden, which is exactly what we're seeing.
Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.